Thank you, Mr. Asselund. I would now like to invite to the panel William Antholis, the Managing Director of Brookings Institution, Maria Antonakos, Director of Advancement for the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics, George Kaminis, Mayor of Athens, Ignacio Saiz, Executive Director for the Center for Economic and Social Rights, and Gerry Salole, Chief Executive of the European Foundation Center. This plenary session will be moderated by our very own Stelios Vasilakis, Senior Program Officer for Strategy and Initiatives and Co-Chief Public Affairs Officer of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. At the end of this session, questions will be available also for the presentation that was just delivered by Mr. Anders Asselund. Thank you.
Good afternoon again. I think we're missing Mr. Kaminis, the Mayor of Athens, for the time being, but we can start. And the way the panel is organized does not matter for the moment. He can join in as soon as he arrives. A couple of things about logistics, the way the panel will run. What I intend to do is to ask 2 questions to each one of the panelists. I will start with Bill Antholis. He will have about 10 minutes to answer. Then we'll move to the next speaker. 2 questions again. They have 10 minutes. They can also talk about what the person before them talked about. And then at the end, we hope that the answers that have been provided by the panelists will generate a general discussion between them about all the issues that they've talked about. And at the end, we will have about 20 to 30 minutes, and we will open the floor to questions from the audience. I will not describe in detail each one of the panelists' distinguished CVs. They're already available in the booklet that we have distributed, so I will just mention their names and the titles for the sake of brevity and move on. And I will start with Bill Antholis, Managing Director, Brookings Institution. We are talking about minimizing the state doing less and somebody else doing more in the place of the state. And there can be many explanations about it, but what we should look at right now and what I'm interested at is why we have this paradigm shift at this particular moment. Why something that has been happening over a very long period of time is changing right now. I know that everybody says that the challenges are great and cannot be addressed only by the state, but it is a paradigm shift and we should look into it. The notion of helping others, helping citizens, providing public services has had a history of over 3,000 years in Western society. It started with the notion of charity, wealthy individuals or the church providing help to all those who needed it. And then, as things began to shift, as we saw the emergence of market economy, the Industrial Revolution, and the emergence of a central government, the needs became greater, and the central government took the responsibility to provide services, social welfare services, what used to be charity, to all those who needed it. Everything became more institutionalized with the Elizabethan Poor Law in 1601. So what we saw was turning into the state to provide social welfare services, because we had very radical changes in the society, in the way the society worked, and the needs became greater. This is what we're seeing today also. We are saying that the needs of society are much greater because of the technological revolution and globalization. The needs are greater, and they cannot be addressed by the state anymore, but other players need to come into play. So basically, for the same exactly reasons, we're going into two opposite directions. At the beginning, the state had to jump in to provide those services because of the shifts in the way society worked and the greater need. But today, because of the shifts in the way society works and the greater needs, we are saying that the state needs to back away and cannot do it anymore. So Bill, why do we have this paradigm shift? Why we have this paradox that we're looking at?
Well, I think the framing is correct. I mean, I think that thinking back in time, 3,000 years, where the concepts were developed about the role of the citizen, the role of smaller organizations, and the role of the state did start at that time. And you have a language about citizen engagement and the role of the state that still frames the way we think about it, but scale that is radically different. So 3,000 years ago, during the Greek city-states, you had communities that were numbered in the thousands, as big as tens of thousands, eventually here in Athens and other city-states. But we still use this language, and I think Aristotle, Andreas spoke of Aristotle. Aristotle coined the phrase citizen and described it in its purest form, which was the idea of reciprocity, ruling and being ruled in turn. You went to the Pnyx, you voiced your will if you were a regular voter. If you were in the higher councils, you had more role in shaping the agenda. But then eventually you were ruled by those rules that you gave. And as modern states developed and as the scale got bigger, we had to expand that concept and give the state greater powers. And the moment when the citizen ruled was limited to very rare instances. And the moments that the government ruled were significantly greater because you just had this scale issue. What filled that void was very different on different sides of the Atlantic. These two very different notions developed in modern democracy, when modern democracies were being founded 200 years ago. And essentially they've become caricatures of one another, but in the United States we developed a system. It took a Frenchman to help explain it to us in Alexis de Tocqueville, where citizens ended up filling this space, and at the local level created what we now call civil society or non-governmental organizations. He had his own phrase for public associations of various kinds. But the driving concept here was self-interest rightly understood, that citizens realized that if their active engagement as citizens was going to extend beyond the simple moment of choosing their leaders, they weren't even writing their own laws anymore, they were choosing their leaders. Their way to stay engaged was to take over functions that notionally should be the role of the state, but since the state was so far away, they wanted to do locally. And philanthropy developed in a very activist sense because of the absence of the state playing that role. Europe just adopted a very different model. The same Aristotelian concepts were taken on by Rousseau and Kant. The idea of a citizen giving a rule to society that they would be willing to be governed by. But essentially that became a very abstract concept, and those powers were given to the state, and the state was held responsible for doing a lot of things that developed at a very local, organic level in the United States. So you have these two archetypes that developed for how to deal with these things. Give the powers away to the state, or keep them in small associations. Of course, there's a hybrid in both societies, on both sides of the Atlantic. In the United States, essentially in the early part of the 19th century, the state started to get involved mostly after we went to war, first in World War I and then World War II. And the state started to come back, mostly taking care of widows and orphans for people who fought in the wars. That's where the state stepped in and started providing things that had always been done philanthropically in the United States. Hospitals, schools, the federal government and even the state governments really didn't take over those kinds of responsibilities until after these great moments of war. In Europe, it was always seen as that was the role of the state. But increasingly now, we're starting to see greater philanthropic engagement. So for instance, Anders talked about the role of think tank engagement, and he absolutely correctly characterized the difference. In the United States, universities have largely been private, and public universities only happened in the late 1800s. There were a few in the early 1800s, but they largely came on in the late 1800s and early 1900s. In Europe, obviously, the tradition is different, but we have seen this flourishing and this recent creation in Europe of think tanks that are independent from the state. Whereas in the United States, the idea was always that ideas should come outside of government. That was the role of civil society, was to generate ideas, to bring ideas to bear. In Europe, that is now coming on. In the United States, healthcare was always provided by the private sector. It came through corporations pay for people's healthcare. But increasingly, as that gets regulated and we've started to see the failures in that system, the state is taking a larger role, and that's happened first in the Bush administration, but now in the Obama administration. In Europe, again, largely held by the state, but we're starting to see the role of the private. So essentially, my view is that reciprocity is really important here. Citizens have to play a role. They keep it honest. They have to play a role in idea formation and in the delivery of services. But the state also has an important role. And we're seeing a corrective function, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic now. In the moment of crisis here in Europe, and particularly in Greece, I think there is a moment for private philanthropy to step forward, but the state has to make that easier. We have things in the United States that make it very easy. The tax deductibility of charitable donations, not taxing philanthropic organizations. That's something that's a very new concept in many parts of Europe. In the United States, it makes think tanks operate. It makes a lot of private charitable organizations operate very effectively and compete with private organizations in a very effective way.
Okay. We are asking the third sector, the non-profit sector, to take a more active role. And traditionally, when we speak about NGOs providing services, they either advocate for those in need or they provide help for those in need. So if we are going to take the state away, or if we ask for the state to play a lesser role, who is going to provide the funding for the NGOs? Traditionally, today, 70% of the funding provided to all NGOs, whether they do advocacy or whether they provide services for those in need, 70% of their funding comes from the state. That's the case in the United States, and I believe it might be even higher in Europe. So if we are asking the state to play a lesser role, what would that role be? Who will finance those NGOs? Who will do that part? When we know for a fact that foundations have provided about 2% of support for those organizations.
Well, again, I think if it's not the state, then it has to be the private sector, both individuals, foundations, and corporations. Let me come back to this tax deductibility issue, which was a major issue. And there are good arguments against tax deductibility. Right now in the United States, we're having to deal with our own budget issues, which are really quite dramatic. in many ways as dramatic as what's going on here. And one thing that people have looked at is closing various tax loopholes. And one loophole that gets looked at is the charitable deduction. It's considered a tax expenditure. If that charitable deduction was not given, then more tax revenues in theory would come to the state. But it's a theoretical question because many times people might choose not to spend that money. So the idea is, well, the state's losing this revenue because of the tax deductibility issue. Maybe it's not losing that revenue. Maybe people choose to give regardless of tax deductibility. But the simple fact that the expenditures do happen is a vibrant part of social welfare provision of various kinds: hospitals, universities, yes, think tanks, direct charitable organizations. And part of the reason that people feel that they give to those organizations is they feel that they have a greater access to who is spending the money, how well the money is being spended, how effectively it's being spended. And so there's a bit of a risk here in Europe in making such donations exempt from taxation. Likewise, there's a risk in the United States of taking that away because perhaps those social provisions will not be well done by the state or they would disappear. It's a tricky and important issue. I think it's worth considering here. I think there is an enormous amount of generosity that could be unleashed by making it easier for people to contribute.
Thank you. I would like to turn now to Maria Antonakos, who's Director of Advancement at the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics in Canada. You have been teaching a course in strategic philanthropy at the DeGroote School of Business in Hamilton, Ontario. One of the things that you'll be talking to students about is social responsibility, and in particular, corporate social responsibility. This is an issue that has been discussed a lot lately. A lot of people, when they envision the private sector playing a much more important role, if we are talking about a social welfare society, they talk about social responsibility. They would like to see this notion of social responsibility taken more seriously from the private sector. Can you talk a little bit more about this?
Sure, thank you. The course that I teach at McMaster is part of a program called the Learning by Giving Foundation, and that was started by Doris Buffett, the sister of Warren Buffett. And it's a program that's rolling out across the United States whereby students actually have money that they're giving away. So, and they learn about the charitable sector because they are actually writing checks to real organizations. My course is in a business school, so I teach fourth year students, fourth year business students. And what I'm coming away from in this experience is that these are students, and this is the Generation Y, that are deeply concerned about the situation that they're facing and that they're going into. And when they think about corporate social responsibility, for them, it's as important that they do good as well as doing well. And so for them, the whole idea of corporate social responsibility is something that they seem to be taking very personally. I started this course in 2008. I taught my first course the week that Lehman Brothers Bank was going down in the United States. It was a staggeringly interesting time. These were business students who, up until this point, figured they were doing MBAs and they were going to go into very serious work in the financial markets. And I've noticed now the last time, and I taught the course again this spring, in 2013, it's in that short period of time, this is an entirely different cohort of students. These are people that care about whether or not they have a place in the world where they have meaning. And there was a recent study regarding Generation Y in the United States. 72% of students graduating from courses in the United States said that they are looking for meaningful work that would bring them, that had a social impact. That was absolutely paramount. And of that 72%, 85% of them said they would take less money in order to fulfill that goal. So I feel that philanthropy in a business school is a true vehicle for actually teaching on the front lines students and about how they can impact the world and how they can make a change within their corporations, if they're part of a corporate social responsibility program, if they are, lucky enough to be very successful entrepreneurs, like the chairman of the institute that I work at, if they're just everyday philanthropists, in that everyone has a place in the world to make a difference.
Thank you. Now, the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics, it's a great example of a private-public partnership. And this is a model that people talk a lot about as a great way to deal with social issues. But there is also a lot of concern about it, in the sense that a lot of people feel sometimes that the weight tilts towards the private part of it more than the public. Can you talk about it a little bit, please?
Sure. So the institute that I work at is an institute for theoretical physics. It's the largest institute of its kind in the world. It was founded by Mike Lazaridis, who founded the BlackBerry. And it's an interesting story, and so many of the examples today from Professor Asland and also Bill, the idea that if you have an idea and a passion, and if you take the step forward to actually make it happen with your own resources, you can, at a certain point, affect change whereby the state then will come in. And that's precisely what happened with the Perimeter Institute. So at the Perimeter Institute, Mike, when he was 38 years of age, had a deep and unabiding passion for physics. He was deeply concerned about our market society and the value-driven society that we had in terms of the global markets. And he understood that, in fact, the science and technology that was underpinning everything in our everyday life was really based on theoretical physics. And so his feeling was that if he established this institute and strategically invested in theoretical physics, the work that Einstein did, the work that Maxwell did, that he could affect social change on a grand scale. And he put his money in first. He had the vision, he spent the time working on it, and after the fact, the government came in. And they have been partners right from the very beginning. And where I think the concern about, maybe edging too much on the private side, is that, does a philanthropist actually start then dictating the outcomes of the institute or the hospital or the university that they help to find? And in fact, in the case of our institute, it's an incredibly well-run institute, and it's a completely hands-off operation. I think one of the points that I want to make around this, in this room, is that, again, I have this feeling that there's a sea change coming whereby all of us can affect change. And we have these opportunities at the very large level for, a George Soros or a Mike Lazaridis or a Stavros and Niarchos Foundation to affect change. And at the same time, we have great opportunities at a community level to affect change. And I believe that there's a symbiotic and an opportunity on a continuum to have that change really be effective.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, welcome. I had you third in line, but if you want to catch your breath up and you want to wait, you can go forth. Is that okay? Thank you.
But I'm speaking in Greek.
I think that's fine, because there is automatic translation, so that should not be an issue. That's not an issue at all. But I will address the question in English. Is that okay?
No problem.
Thank you. In your abstract, you said that the welfare state, and this is something that is well known to everyone in this room, the welfare state is falling apart because of the crisis. And as a result, the state funding for municipalities has radically decreased. You talked about social solidarity as a way of addressing the issues, and as the only way, actually, of addressing the issues right now. When we talk about solidarity, how effective can it be when you do not have all parties involved with it? And in this particular case, it seems, and people have talked about this, that neither the philanthropic sector, with very few examples in Greece, or the private sector has stepped up to the plate to help with the crisis. So how can solidarity be effective if not all players are on the same level of what needs to be done?
I will give my answer.
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you. Η οικονομική κρίση
The financial crisis, which has struck the countries of the south of Europe, has overturned most of our beliefs, most of the acquis of the European welfare state. In reality, it worked as a catalyst for the total reshaping of all the parameters for social policy and welfare structures that we had known to then. And as happens in similar occasions, the financial crisis and its subsequent implications socially and for all citizens did cause a lot of change. One of the basic changes is the weakening of the welfare state in the countries of the south of Europe, and in particular in Greece. One of the second implications, and it is of equal importance, is the imperative need to have a new concept of how the welfare state will be functioning in the future. We need a new vision for welfare policy, social welfare policy. This is a problem that we had to deal with from the very first day I took up my position in Athens, from the 1st of January 2011, when I was appointed mayor. We saw that it was an explosive mix. For over 2 decades, we had certain structures of social welfare that had disappeared, and without being granted a transitional period, the funds, the state funds that were given to municipalities shrunk. At the time when the unemployed, those who had no means, no housing, were multiplying dramatically. And we are still at that point in time. We are in a country where economic cohesion has been put under severe trial. The situation is quite dangerous because what we see happening is that there is a strengthening of political parties that are racist, xenophobic, and intolerant. So the margins we had were not great, and concurrently, our needs were extremely pressing because what we have is a transition from an economic crisis, which in the case of the city of Athens can be seen as a humanitarian crisis. We had to keep this city alive. We had to guarantee social cohesion as far as possible. So we tried to act at 2 levels: a new framework for social welfare policy, and also to look for the targeted funds, which we would no longer request from the state or from the public purse, but from other sources. And to understand this, for all of Greek municipalities, not just for Athens, the funding provided by the state, the funding dropped by 60% if we compare to the amount of funding we received in 2009. So that's one source of funding that disappeared. And we also have municipal taxes paid to the municipality through the electricity bill. And as companies were pulling their shutters down, as flats and houses are no longer rented, the municipal tax from the electricity bill has dropped by 30%. So we could no longer depend on the state. And at the same time, we had to overcome our dependence on cliches that ruled society before. We needed to look for the active segment of society, volunteers, NGOs, and charities from the private sector. So we tried to become the link between the city and those offering sources. So to manage, to contribute, to cooperate with those who spontaneously offered help from within society. And these were traditional philanthropic organizations or just groups of citizens who became more sensitive to the issue because of the crisis and wanted to contribute. What we did was to, first of all, maintain the traditional structures of the municipality, but we increased them in order to be able to deal with the effects of the crisis. So, for example, we had a soup kitchen, and we would feed 3,000 poor people per day. And at this point, we're offering 9,000 meals per day. So those who are houseless and without means, and we make no discrimination between nationalities. As I said, hunger does not hold a passport or an ID card. 9,000 meals. We go to schools and we feed 1,000 children in the day-long schools that are brought to our attention by their professors, because there it is obvious which children are going hungry, because some take food to school and others don't. So we tried to do it as invisibly as possible, but we do offer them meals. So apart from these traditional soup kitchens, we needed to support families and individuals with particular goods. So we have the Solidarity Hub. We have 3,000 families in our municipality, which means 10,000 people, and this is a number that's constantly growing, who are regularly receiving food boxes. And in that you have packaged food, you have pulses, pasta, tins, detergents, things that you need in a household, and milk for the kids. The NGOs help us a lot. The Greek Ship Owners Association is a traditional supporter of ours, and very recently we received an offer for help from the Norwegian government. We received €2 million to support these 3,000 families, and as I said, this is a number that keeps growing. The percentage there out of these 3,000 families is 30% foreigners, 70% Greeks. We have other families. We have 400 families that go to the social grocery, and we're helped by Carrefour Marinopoulos, the company there. We have other families in the area of Koukaki who are supported through a Cosmote phone company program. We have the social pharmacist that offers medicine to people. We have housing for the homeless, and we have a daycare center as well, so they can come to that and shower or wash their clothes and receive a plate of food, and in fact maybe even psychological advice or counseling if that's necessary. And also shelter for the night hours, which has just been set up. We have a primary care center with the insurance fund of EOP, and there we have a lot of doctors contributing, and we have kiosks all over Athens where people can come and ask us, and depending on the kind of care they need, we will tell them where to go. And we have the municipal health centers, and there finally we can now offer medicine, because in the past doctors working there were not able to write prescriptions, but they've finally been given the right to do that. So we act at the municipality as a hub to actually guide people to where they need to go to find what they need. Now I'll draw this to a conclusion, because I need to draw a distinction here between charity and what I call a philanthropy or social solidarity. And I say this because I am a professor of constitutional law, and our constitution does not mention philanthropy, but says social solidarity. Why? Because there is the fundamental value in our constitution, which is human dignity. And human dignity has to be guaranteed, and it is maintained, first of all, through helping people with their basic needs. They need to be fed, they need to be clothed, and they need to be able to cover their basic needs. But the most substantial support to human dignity is offered when you offer people the possibility to take control of their destiny. And that's of importance, of huge importance in a society where we were taught to live through state benefits, through dependence from the state. Because if you have European programs, this is something that we've managed to maintain, to re-educate the unemployed, to set up companies, social companies, social economy companies, because, for example, a lot of our staff lose their jobs. So we need to teach them how to use the infrastructure we will be providing for them. For example, kindergartens. For example, people working there. We have the buildings, we have the people working there, and we can give them coupons and food for the kids that will be going there, and they can privately run these nurseries. So that would bring down the cost to operate them, and they would offer the same level of services to these young children, and it would help these people working there not to feel insecure in their jobs, and they would be setting up their own company. This is revolutionary, and it helps us to move from philanthropy to real social solidarity through promoting human dignity. Thank you for listening.
Just another very quick question, if you can answer it briefly, would be great. You are a public servant, so you have experienced the diminishing ability of the public sector to offer services from the inside. You talked about the solidarity role, and you talked about the public sector functioning as a link, bringing together many different players to help. Now, when the crisis is over, is that the model that you envision for the public sector? Do we go back to what it was before? Can we go back to what it was before? Or what you see the public sector doing is functioning as a link, and how effective can that be?
It goes without saying that I'm in the second thing, is that I'm in the public sector as a link, as someone who coordinates social forces, as someone who evaluates, as someone who controls, but as someone who gives, the primary role, the most important role to civil society. We go behind the stage, but at the same time we exercise a coordinating role in the broader sense. So at the same time we offer better services, and since we have a smaller public sector, we have less corruption. It's very important, speaking about Greece. And at the same time, as I said, the most important is that we mobilize people to be the masters of their own destiny.
Thank you. I would like to turn now to Ignacio Saiz, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Economic and Social Rights. You have spoken on your abstract about the impact of the crisis, the European economic crisis, as devastating. And you see this, you define this as being a crisis on human rights, which is it's approaching the issue in a very different way. If that's the case, how that works with this whole idea of a social welfare society, how seeing this from a human rights point of view works with the social welfare society concept.
Thank you very much, Stelios. Yeah, I think seeing this issue from a human rights perspective leads us in a way to question at least the premise that is running through this conference, that the current situation demands that we look primarily beyond the state for solutions to our current social welfare problems. I believe that we're living in times that demand better governance, not necessarily less government. And I want to illustrate this with reference to Spain. I speak as an NGO, as a non-governmental organization, which has been working in many parts of the world to document the impacts, the human rights impacts of the economic crisis, and more recently of the wave of austerity measures which have become the dominant policy trend. In our view, I mean, it's been advanced, the crisis in Europe has been advanced as evidence of the need to reduce public expenditure, to limit the role of the state in public service delivery, to deregulate markets, etc. In our view, these policies are being implemented. Certainly we're seeing them in countries of Southern Europe. I would call these austerity measures. In our view, they're fueling the crisis and not helping to address it. We believe that they have turned what was originally an economic crisis into a crisis for human rights, and particularly for social rights. So I think any discussion on the role of philanthropy in a welfare society has to begin by taking stock of those human impacts of this current policy trend. Because it's ultimately the impacts on human rights that should concern us. That's the ultimate metric of human well-being and of social welfare. The center that I head up, the Center for Economic and Social Rights, as I say, has been monitoring the impacts of the economic downturn since 2009. And I'll fast forward to our findings findings in the case of Spain and Ireland, two countries of Europe, of the periphery of Europe, if you like. I don't like that term, but peripheral Europe, which has been particularly devastated by the crisis. By austerity measures, by the way, we mean a series of policies that usually comprise drastic cuts to public social expenditure, usually public sector wage cuts, reductions in pensions and other critical social protection schemes, which have included in Spain and Ireland, cutting food subsidies or cutting child benefit allowances. The third package of measures tend to be around labor reforms aimed at making the workforce more flexible and more competitive. And fourthly, the emphasis on generating revenue has tended to focus on very selective tax increases, usually consisting in increases in value-added tax, and the privatization of public services as a means of generating additional revenue for the public coffers. So let me just quickly zap through a couple of statistics around the impact of these measures in Spain, where CSR has looked at the National Stability Program and a series of austerity budgets from 2011 and 2012, which basically cut 27 billion from the public budget, much of it in areas of social expenditure such as education and housing, and included a 7 billion cut in the area of health. We believe that these kinds of measures are undermining social protection just when it's needed most. To give you a sense, unemployment has just continued to soar in Spain. It's now even higher than when we published this graphic. It's now at 27%, with 57% youth unemployment. The percentage of people who are long-term unemployed has increased by 5. 1 in 10 households now in Spain has no income earner at all. 1 in 4 people are on temporary contracts, one of the highest rates in the whole of Europe, and so on and so forth. The minimum wage has basically stagnated. Sorry, this is to do with job insecurity, the number of people on temporary contracts in Spain being the highest in the EU. Minimum wage basically stagnating. That's the yellow, thicker figure at the bottom. I'm just using this as illustrations of how the measures which are being passed as part of these austerity measures are really having a very harmful impact on people's basic rights around employment, rights to health, rights to education. Let me just zap through. In terms of housing, the collapse of the housing bubble in Spain was one of the reasons why the crisis has had such a particularly devastating impact in the country. Currently, the number of, the percentage of the population facing what is called a housing cost overburden rate has more than doubled since 2006 and now represents more than half of the population. Evictions are continuing apace. Some 350,000 people have been subject to foreclosures by 2011. And yet, social housing stock, affordable social housing, still remains amongst the lowest in Europe. This is the proportion of housing stock, which is lowest in Spain, very low in Spain. Well, it's also particularly low in Greece, but Spain is amongst the lowest in the EU. With regard to poverty, poverty continues to escalate. 27% of the population deemed to be at risk of poverty. Child poverty levels have particularly escalated and have grown at a more alarming rate. The yellow line there is child poverty. As you can see, the increase is steeper than with the average level. And one thing I really want to, well, this is the disaggregation of poverty. We've also tried to look at who is particularly at risk of poverty. This disaggregates the average figure by gender and then by age. And as you can see, by far the highest risk of poverty is faced by females aged 65 or over, 1 in 3 of whom are at risk of poverty in Spain. There are geographical disparities too, which I won't go into here. One thing I want to bring out, because this is a phenomenon in Greece, in Portugal, in Ireland, in other countries where austerity measures are really hitting home, is widening income inequality. You can see from this graphic, Spain is the red line on top, the other two are the EU 27 and EU 15 averages. You see income inequality really rising extremely sharply as the effects of the crisis kick in. If you prolong this after 2010, as austerity measures were taking effect, inequality has widened even further. And this indicates that the costs of the crisis are being borne primarily by those already worse off and those in society who had little hand in its creation. Our work in Ireland has also come up with similar findings, which I won't go into here for reasons of time. What I want to argue, though, that from a human rights perspective, we need to search for policies which are more coherent and consistent with governments' human rights obligations. And we believe that there are at least 3 areas in which alternatives to austerity need to be pursued, which I would argue are more consistent with human rights obligations, but which are also arguably more effective in economic terms. These are the budget cuts in Spain hitting areas of social protection precisely where they're needed most in 2012. But moving on to, moving on here to alternatives. One is generating public revenue in a more equitable way. This is critical, obviously, for resourcing social investment, but also critical for the reduction of inequalities. Here we see that Spain, like several other countries, Portugal, Italy, Greece, has a huge shadow economy as a percentage of GDP. And efforts to deal with the crisis have really been insufficient in dealing with the tax side of the fiscal equation rather than with the budget side. With regard to Spain, this figure here shows the inner circle is the amount that was cut from the public budget in 2011-2012, 27 billion. The outer circle in ochre color is 88 billion, which is the total revenue which is lost to tax evasion. We've been working with tax administrators to look at the viability of alternative revenue-generating solutions that clamp down even minimally on the problem of tax evasion in Spain. And even bringing tax evasion down by a small percentage would have generated much more than was actually cut in the budget cut last year. Both in Ireland and in Spain, these continue to be countries with amongst the lowest level of government revenue as a percentage of GDP. Personal income tax rates of higher earners have remained untouched, and indeed in Spain they've been reduced for the last 10 years. And we believe that this is having a profoundly inequitable effect in the sense that the revenue-generating policies have primarily consisted, as I mentioned earlier, of value-added taxation, which by and large has had a profoundly regressive impact, bearing down disproportionately on those least able to pay. Perhaps I realize I'm probably overstating my time, but I think just to come back to the question of alternatives, generating public revenue more fairly, ensuring a social protection floor, pursuing employment policies more conducive to decent work and decent working conditions, and also addressing some of the outstanding root causes of the crisis, including insufficient financial regulation. We believe these four measures are essential measures which are more consistent with government's human rights obligations, but also arguably, as has been argued by many economists, would provide a more equitable solution towards economic recovery. From a human rights perspective, the biggest difference in the way the issues are framed is that we believe that social welfare, access to social security, health, education, these are rights rather than privileges. While there is a role undoubtedly for the private sector and for the third sector in the better delivery of public services in times of economic constraint, the government really has a unique role to play, and it's the government that is primarily the central duty bearer. For this reason, the government is also, the state is also the primary locus of accountability towards citizens. And I want to end on this point because I think accountability has been a big deficit in the countries that we have been working in. There have been minimal opportunities for public deliberation of the kinds of policies that have been put in place, and very little options for those promoting alternatives. It's concerning to me to hear Professor Aslan say that consensus is impossible, and therefore to suggest almost that that public deliberation does more harm than good, and that it might act as an obstacle to decisive action. This really is an authoritarian strain that I think civil society organizations such as ours would question very profoundly. And we would like to see the philanthropic sector promoting ways of promoting mechanisms by which citizens and non-governmental organizations can play a more active watchdog role, can critique the policies that are being put in place, can set up mechanisms for review and audit from the perspective of their human impacts and human rights impacts. And I think there's a role for philanthropy also in ensuring that, that public cuts and public expenditure cuts do not affect watchdog bodies within the state's own apparatus, such as national human rights institutions, equality bodies, and anti-poverty bodies, which in the case of Ireland and Spain have been decimated as a result of these policies.
Thank you. I did have another question, but you've run over time, so if we have time, we'll come back to you. I will turn to Gerry Salole now, who is the Chief Executive of the European Foundation Center, with whom we have collaborated in this second annual conference on philanthropy. Andreas Rakopoulos spoke about the fact that the philanthropic sector cannot replace the state. It can help, but it cannot replace the state. George Soros, who will be speaking tomorrow, has also said that we are asking philanthropy to do too much, and we are overstating the ability of philanthropy to provide, to make a huge difference. If we are asking the philanthropic sector to play a different role from the one it has been playing before within the framework of a social welfare society, as someone who has been involved with the philanthropic sector over a long period of time, what would that role be?
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. Let me start by saying thank you for having me here. My reaction to that question is I'm not entirely sure I accept the premise. I think it's a question of scale, and if we don't think about scale, so if you can imagine the swimming pool outside and the Mediterranean Sea, the difference between philanthropic resources and the sea is roughly approximate. So really, the idea that philanthropy, that charity, is going to be able to replace the state is a non-starter just in terms of scale. Right. You add to that I often say to my members, so I don't mind admitting to all of you, that I find the philanthropic world full of very special privileges. It's a world in which the most important, perhaps one of the fundamental things you need to know about foundations to be able to work with them is how jealously they protect their independence and how jealously they protect their own mandates. So the struggle has always been, how do you get foundations or charities to work together, because each of them has their own direction, and each of them is actually, in the end, quite convinced that they know what it is they need to do. So you have to come at the problem, I think, somewhat differently. You have to start recognizing the role that philanthropy has been playing and the role it changes doing all the time. So, I mean, let me start with this. I titled the presentation I was going to give, which I won't give, you'll be glad to know, the Foundations and the Interregnum. And the point is that foundations and actual social scientists and politicians and journalists and the world are always waiting for the miracle to happen. They're always waiting for this crisis to be over and talk about what happens post-crisis. I was trying to present, I think, a picture of foundations that are very old and foundations that are very new. And I would have loved to have a little bit of an argument about the understanding of what European philanthropy is doing or isn't doing, but we can do that later. But one of the things that I think you need to understand is how long the tradition of philanthropy is and how sui generis it is, how intrinsic it is to the sort of human condition and to the crises that are thrown up by society. And so, frankly, even this morning when we met at the Vasilakis Foundation to talk about the European Foundation Statute, we heard what the Vasilakis Foundation is doing to change the way it's working, to change its governance structure, to change the way that organization is structured, the kinds of problems it's taking on. And all over Europe, actually in other parts of the world too, we're seeing foundations respond to the crisis in innovative and very different ways, in ways they have always been doing. And the problem then is, how do you identify things that are happening that really could merit more serious attention, perhaps some careful scaling up? And the balance between, do you put a Band-Aid on or do you take the patient to a hospital, is really the key one. So I completely agree with George Soros. Where foundations have resources and have some capacity to modify what it is they're doing it. The problem is whether other people are ready to pick up on the changes and find ways of helping. I mean, let me just give an example. I won't mention the name. There is a foundation in Europe that was probably the biggest foundation in Europe when I became the chief executive of the EFC. It's now probably one of the smallest. It's lost a lot of its assets. It's changed its way of working, and it's still responding to the constituency it feels needs its support by actually doing something completely different, by actually saying we are going to try and find resources for the people we should have been looking after, and we're no longer able to because of mistakes we've made. And that kind of thing needs serious support. So it means people needing to notice what those foundations are doing and finding ways in which they can leverage other funds. And I think this is a place we should be trying to think about the relationship between government and philanthropy. And let's talk positively for a second about European philanthropy. The relationship between governments and European philanthropy is very different than the one in the States. I agree with that. And therefore, the kind of private-public partnerships that are possible and the way of engaging between the institutions and philanthropy are much richer. And so it's a matter of actually flowing with the times. And I thought actually that Anders' comments, if I can be excused just to say this, was just simply, I don't think it was saying we want there not to be consensus. It's that when you have innovation, in fact you're going to get more innovation when people disagree, and in fact you're going to have more movement when different approaches are permitted. And I think that frankly the thing that foundations hold on to so preciously, their independence of action, their independence of boards, etc., actually looks like an incredible weakness. It looks like an incredible luxury until you go and see how foundations change on the ground and how they respond to things. And then you realize, oh my gosh, isn't it good that there is that much variety? So I can give you examples of where variety takes you to different places. So the scale is the real problem. And frankly, because you have very small resources, you damn well be careful that you're using the swimming pool water very, very carefully. And perhaps using that swimming pool water in different ways, and not like you would use the water from the Mediterranean Sea. I'll stop there.
Just another very quick question. When you talk about being very focused, this whole idea about focus responsibility, when it comes to the work that foundations do, it's one that has been discussed quite a lot. And this is an ethical question, actually, and people have started debating this a lot. When we talk about focus responsibilities, deciding where to focus so that you maximize input. And I just wanted to get your view on that a lot of people feel that, foundations spread themselves too thin, that if they have focus on a particular issue, that they can be much, much more effective. It is, of course, an ethical question. And the reason I'm asking this is because there was a wonderful talk about Peter Singer, a distinguished ethicist, who said that, you can spend $40,000 for a guide dog for the blind, and if you use the same exactly resources, you can cure about 2,000 people in Africa from trachoma. And as resources become limited, this idea of focus responsibility is becoming more and more important. And I just wanted to get a comment on this.
Yes, my honest answer to that is I think it's really dangerous to be a social engineer to that degree, and to have anybody who has the presumption to think that, this is the way everybody should be going. I think there is too much of this in the development sector, and as crisis hits, it's very easy to sit and say, this is the one thing you should be doing. And the truth is that you need different approaches to take root, and the idea that you can kind of move resources at one problem and solve it is an oversimplification of the problems we face. I mean, to be honest, you can solve one problem and you'll get another. So the idea that somehow it's waiting for the miracle to happen, the idea that you are going to solve problems scientifically with resources or with focus and end up in a world that has no more problems, it brings me exactly to sort of the quote from Bob Dylan I have in my, who he not busy born, busy being born is busy dying. So the truth is you're always going to have new things and new crises. And for example, we have foundations that have decided to spend out, put their resources into one very specific thing and then get out of business. But their intent is not to get out because philanthropy will no longer be necessary. Their intent is that there are others who should step in and other resources that should become available. When some foundations went out of business and worked themselves out of business in the 60s and 70s, they couldn't dream that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was just around the corner. And with the growth of really new philanthropies that are working with much larger amounts of resource, I think we're actually, history has taught us that resources, smaller resources, I'm not talking about this kind of resources of the sea, but the pool resources can be replenished and new philanthropies can exist. And we should be creating legislation to make it possible for new money to come to the table, which is why we think, you know, the European Foundation Statute is such an important thing to push.
Thank you. I think we have about 25 minutes. I would like to open the floor to questions from the audience. I would like to invite Anders Aslan to come up, in case people want to ask him a question. Please.
Yeah, thank you. If I only may respond to what Ignacio said about me, Gerry has already explained what I was really saying. The point is that in a serious crisis, you never have a consensus. So to try to get a consensus in a serious crisis, it means to say that you shouldn't try to solve it. The normal resolution, or the successful resolution, I should say, it is that the old vested interests are beaten. And in order to do that, you essentially need a democratic vote from below, because it's the majority that you are defending and I'm defending who benefit from the breaking of the vested interest. And normally they have to come from the outside. And obviously they tramp on the interest of you. So I don't think that we have that disagreement. Thank you.
Please state your name and affiliation and be as clear and concise as you can be. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm Lionel Foster with Johns Hopkins University Center for Talented Youth. We're talking a lot about the need, or certainly the desire, for philanthropic organizations to do more. I'm interested especially in hearing from Mr. Salole. Forgive me if I mispronounce your name. Could you talk about what motivates donors to do what they do to begin with? So we talk about the need for them to do more, but why do so many step up? What types of motivations do you see amongst the foundations you work with?
Do you want me to answer? Or?
Yeah, please. Any of you.
I mean, very quickly, really you get all kinds of people. First of all, not all foundations are created by individuals who are rich, who decide to give their resources. Europe has an incredible plethora of different kinds of foundations, some of which the foundation is the owner of a very large company. And therefore, basically, it isn't beholden to one single donor, etc. The other thing is that there's an incredible number of foundations that were started, as some of them as early as the 15th century, that were just citizens coming together and pooling resources. So one of Europe's biggest foundations, the Compagnia di San Paolo, which has about 9 billion euro in assets, is an organization that was started by 7 citizens who wanted to look after immigrants who were dying on the streets of Torino in 1470. So we have all sorts of examples. So what motivates people is all sorts of things. Sometimes it's because you feel that you've done something and you want to give back. Sometimes it's because you have an idea of what is going to solve the problem. It's back to the focus question. And you think that if you put resources into that one thing, you're going to solve a very important issue. And there are many foundations that are driven by just one single issue, early childhood, whatever. So in a way, it's almost as complex as talking about any other kind of thing that humans do, that motivation is multiple and different. And sometimes it's not even the happiest kind of things that drive people to do foundations. Guilt can be a good reason to create a foundation. Some people put resources into a foundation simply because they feel they want to protect their family from having too much wealth. I mean, that's also reasons why people create foundations. There are so many. I've met so many different reasons that it's so hard to kind of give you a quick answer, and I think I'm probably overdoing it, so I'll stop.
Marcus, BMW Foundation. I just want to add one connotation. I think I like this topic very much about the cross-sectoral cooperation, but sometimes there was a wording about minimizing state. I think if you look to Scandinavia or Northern Europe, or also Germany at the moment, I think it's not about minimizing state, it's much more about making it much more effective. I think we have never had a time in Germany, for example, where we had such a strong state. Yes, we had never had more tax income for the state than this year and last year in Germany, never in history. But we had also never had such a strong civil society and such a growth of philanthropy. We have more than 20,000 foundations, 15,000 the last 10 years. And I think they have never had such a strong economy. So it's not about weaken something or minimize something. It's really to make all players much stronger and much more effective. Also, our philanthropy sector tries and fights hard to get much more effective. And the role of philanthropy, I think, could be really to promote, because we are the freest player in that field. Philanthropy, foundations are the intermediaries to work hardly and riskful, and that kind of innovation of cross-sectoral cooperation. So that's perhaps another connotation than making states weak. If I look to Finland or Sweden, I'm always impressed how strong states can be.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anna Pushkuri from Junior Achievement Greece. I would like also to address my question to our last speaker. You made the example, all the speakers said that there is a question of scale between the magnitude of the need and the scale of the resources available. And I would like to ask you whether you, as European Foundation Center, are having some program in order to combine the swimming pools, to create a network among the swimming pools. And of course, we will not create the Mediterranean Sea again, but they will become bigger. Do you work on this direction? Thank you.
Go ahead, Gerry.
Yes, we are very interested in combining the swimming pools. The truth, though, is that you have to be very respectful of this diversity on the ground. However, having said all of that, how difficult it is and so on, what's remarkable is that in the last 5 or 6 years, the amount of appetite to do things together, this recognition that Anders started with today, of saying, we know we can't do anything alone. We heard that, right at the beginning of the session. People are really not just saying it anymore, they mean it. They really understand that they cannot do things alone. And so the appetite to collaborate in Europe is you can feel it, it's palpable. And the crisis does help. I heard somebody say recently, who I had heard many times saying, why do I need to collaborate with anybody else? I've got the resources, I know what I want to do, why do I need to do it? And I heard that person recently say, oh, now we really have to collaborate. That was like a conversion on the road to Damascus.
My name is Gezeglu, and I come from Galilee Palliative Care Unit. And I guess I address this question to the whole panel, which is you have an NGO society that is willing to provide services to people that the government cannot provide. And how can you persuade or motivate the government to create laws that will make your provision of the services legal, if there's a deficit in that country's laws?
Anyone?
I'm curious to hear a little bit more from the questioner of what is currently, if not illegal, about the services you're trying to provide, where the law is getting in the way. Because in generic terms, this is both a huge issue, but it varies from service provision to service provision.
I don't know if anybody else is interested, but this is palliative care, which I know in your countries is well known, but it's not known in Greece, and there is no law for palliative care. So if you want to create a service and provide medical, for instance, services outside the hospital, or if you're not in private practice, that you cannot do.
Yeah, what I find fascinating in general concept terms about it, and this goes to not just the diversity of foundations and philanthropic giving, but the diversity of civil society organizations, is there is something unique about organizations that, I agree with everything my fellow panelists said about scale. I think I said it myself. Scale is critical. The civil society organizations will never be able to do for really important, massive services, basic health care, basic education, what the state can do. It's the role that civil society organizations often play is convincing the broad public when something crosses the line into being basic. Right now in the United States, the big discussion is whether or not marriage, same-sex marriage is a basic right that the federal government and the federal Constitution should provide. And that's a decade-long process that's played out at the city, state, and national level. So going to your question, one thing that we've learned in the United States is when you're fighting for legal recognition, and particularly in the business of providing services, local demonstration, going back to the city-state, is often critical. And when you get people vested at the local level, they become the best change agents you can have. At Brookings, we're just in the business of changing people's ideas. We don't provide services of any kind. We used to teach. We don't even really teach anymore. But what we have focused on is the question of changing minds and how that happens. And it happens in so many different ways. There's everything from setting an agenda to designing policy details. And what we've come to determine is every different phase of impact, from putting something on the agenda to actually understanding the critical details of something, to something in the middle, shaping a debate around an issue. Each of those comes with a very different advocacy strategy. And oftentimes, the most effective advocates are at the policy design doing level. And that's where actually having civil society organizations that provide services, the swimming pools, the lifeguards at the swimming pools, people that are actually diving into the pool and saving lives. Those are the most effective people for shaping debates and setting agendas. So it's getting people actually in the business of providing services to become writers, activists, spokespeople. They're more effective than people who write books and are just pointy-headed academics.
Hi, my name is Decker Gongang with Echoing Green, and my question is for the panel, but I would love if the mayor and, I'm going to butcher your name, Mr. Salole, could answer this as well. My question is about the role for young people in philanthropy. We oftentimes talk about social entrepreneurship as the role for young people in addressing issues in their community, but my question is around how the younger generation can help shape the next phase of the public sector and the private sector. So I would love to hear how you see young people being able to contribute to philanthropy or to their local governments or their national governments.
Mr. Mayor.
Well, the whole question of mobilizing civil society to assume its own responsibility for philanthropy is something I dare to say is almost entirely new in Greece, because till now, philanthropy was more or less the monopoly of the church. So what we try to do is now to take advantage of this new spontaneous movement of people, and especially young people, who in their own neighborhoods, because of the, the absence of state, because of the lack of resources, they try to take their own initiatives, doing elementary things, gardening, beautification of the streets, etc., but also participating in, social activism. So we create a platform now in the internet. We are inspired by the model of New York Municipality, Cities of Service, and we are going to launch the whole procedure the 10th of July. But I tell you, it's entirely new. We have no experience in that. It's, well, a little bit bizarre to say that also many young people can be mobilized. Why? Because they have no jobs. 60% of young people have no jobs in Greece, have this problem. So we hope to mobilize them and keep them active till we relaunch the economy of the city and of the whole country. That's my answer.
Gerry?
Can I just say that I think one of the, it would be easy to say there really is a role for young people in philanthropy, and the truth is, at least in the context where I work, that the number of young people in the business is awful. We don't attract young people. We don't make it easy for young people's voices to be heard. It's not a world which is easy for a young person to get into, partly because it's such a privileged world, and partly because it's so, unless you are actually part of this universe because you actually belong to a family that's very philanthropic, it's really hard to get into this business. And in Europe, it's particularly hard for young people of color, for example, to get into this. So the whole business of diaspora, any European city you would visit now, you would see an incredible number of people from diverse backgrounds on the streets. In the philanthropic world, this is sincerely a problem. And it's a problem because it means you're not tapping onto some of the incredible new ideas, different ways of doing things, and so on. Just to give you one example, recently an Italian foundation decided to do some work in Africa and decided not to use the usual sources, not to give money to Italian NGOs or to Italian charities or to the church. They decided to give it to African women living in Torino and to just support them with their own remittance money back to Africa. And incredible things have happened with that project. And it's just because somebody thought of a different way of helping. And one of the things that happened to these women, they were very young women, they've also, some of them who were unregistered, become registered and actually become better integrated. They now have better housing and are treated with better respect by their co-citizens in Torino. So there are multiple things you could be doing if only you begin to look at who the people in the area are. And I would say this is one of the problems philanthropy faces. We need to think deeply about the question you asked.
I'm Father Thomas Synodinos from the Archdiocese of Athens. Excuse me, I would like to talk in Greek. Στην συνέχεια αυτών που είπε ο κύριος Δήμαρχος μου.
After what the mayor said, I have the occasion to ask a question and say a couple of words. The mayor said that up until now, or until a few years ago, philanthropy was the monopoly of the church. Of course, the word monopoly is not a happy way to describe it. I would like to thank him for recognizing the contribution of the church, although today nothing has been said so far about the contribution of the church. In an organized civil society, Mayor, I think that the organized society has the responsibility of the welfare state, and Mr. Drakopoulos and Mr. Soros are right when they say that social benefits should be offered by a well-ordered state. Of course, there were needs, there are needs, and there will always be needs. This is why some others try to aid the state in this effort. One of these organizations is the church. You have cooperated with the church, and I think that what you mentioned about the soup kitchens are right, and this has to do with the excellent cooperation the church has with the municipality. And one could also say that the crisis, that today's crisis, or crisis in plural, for the church are not always something bad. They are not always a curse. They can be a blessing because there are new powers unleashed, such as cooperation with various agents of the state or mobilizing people, especially volunteers, in these sectors. I think that any type of aid offered to the church could be more effective. I wonder, why is it that the state finances the NGOs? Is it because the state is in love with the NGOs? And you know, recently we have many of them coming up. Why is it that the state offers money? It is because the state feels that it can no longer cater for all their needs. However, our own well-organized state misses a few things. For example, the funds offered to the specific organizations are not always used effectively. And is there a state control mechanism to ensure that these funds are really effective? For example, how is it possible for the church to offer lunches of €1 and another organization to offer lunches for €3? There is a question here. There is something happening. So maybe in these dire times we have to take other things into consideration as well. How could the state control these funds? Because of course the state has to go on funding the NGOs. How is it possible to find new ways to cooperate? How can the church become more effective? Sometimes people say that your job is to spread the word of the God and save souls. However, I'm a priest, and if I speak about the church dogmas to a hungry person, he's going to run after me. First of all, he has to eat, and then he will be able to understand fine religious questions. So we do have a social role to play. The pool mentioned before, quite aptly, is very limited, and there is recycling of water. Sometimes we have to clean the pool. The state has to clean the pool, and everybody working in these NGOs have to take care of their own houses, and these people should be real philanthropists. Thank you very much.
I will answer in Greek.
Just be brief, we're almost there. Thank you.
Okay. Λοιπόν, δεν έχω λόγο να διαφωνήσω με αυτό.
I can't disagree with what Father Synadinos has just been saying. Yes, perhaps calling it monopoly was not a very successful way of putting it, but you do understand what I meant. The church was the only organized force between society and the state, and just because of this and because of its mission, it did play a leading role as far as social solidarity was concerned, or at least it did take care of philanthropy in this country. And yes, quite rightly, the state has to still have a central role in offering welfare benefits, because we are talking about a welfare state, and it needs to cover the gaps that are there and are not covered by private initiative. In spite of this, one of the collateral positive implications for this country is that it has mobilized social forces to organize, and they are untied by their dependence on the state, and they work and contribute. In a country where civil society, even today, is just a very slight and weak layer, and that's because of historical reasons that I will not go into right now, this is a valuable gift. It's one of the things that we have acquired, the positive things through this crisis. We should make sure we hold on to it and that we expand after the crisis is over. Thank you.
Of efficiency is one that will be discussed a lot in the next day or so. So we'll come back to this, I'm sure, because it's something that everybody's going to right now. I want to thank the panelists and I want to thank the audience for your patience, and we're moving on. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
At this point, we will break into 4 different rooms for the concurrent breakout sessions. The breakout session on accessible education for all will take place in this room. The session on access to food, housing, and employment will take place on the ground floor. It's the room titled Aphrodite. It's right opposite our registration desk. And the 2 sessions on accessible healthcare and disability and accessibility will take place in the lower ground in the rooms Kleoniki A and B. We have more information on the conference rooms plan outside, and if you need anything, our people at the registration desk can assist you. And we look forward to having you all back here at 7:15 for a speech by the Greek Minister of Tourism. Thank you.